Her sisters mocked her at the mate selection, until the Alpha King picked her over them. Illyra Voss felt the carriage wheel hit a stone in the road, and her whole body jolted forward. Her sister Cassia laughed, not because it was funny, but because laughing at Illyra had always been easy. "Careful," Cassia said, smoothing her golden dress. "We would not want you to fall out and miss your own humiliation." Meredith, the middle sister, did not even look up from the small mirror in her hand. She is already going to be humiliated. Falling out of the carriage would only save us the trouble of watching. Illyra said nothing. She had learned, over 18 years, that silence was safer than words. Words gave her sisters something to grab onto, something to twist and throw back at her. Silence gave them nothing. Outside the carriage window, the forest thinned, and the towers of the royal grounds rose in the distance, gray stone catching the late afternoon light. Today was the mate selection, the day the Alpha King of the entire Northern Territory would choose his queen from among the eligible daughters of every pack in the kingdom. It was the most important day in a young woman's life, or so Illyra had been told since she was a child. For her sisters, it was a chance at glory. For Illyra, it was simply another day to survive. "Mother says you should stand at the very back," Meredith added, finally glancing at Illyra. "Behind the tall girls if you can. The king should not have to see something so plain before he has even eaten his morning meal." Illyra's mother, Lady Miriam Voss, sat beside her, her posture perfect, her eyes fixed forward like she was already imagining herself standing beside a throne through her favorite daughter. She did not correct Meredith. She never did. "I only came because father said I must," Illyra said quietly. "I do not expect to be noticed." "Good," Cassia said. "Keep expecting that. It will save you disappointment." The carriage rolled on, and Illyra turned her face to the window, so her family would not see the small ache that crossed her expression. She was used to their words. She had built walls against them, brick by brick, for years. But some days, a crack still let something through. She thought of her father, Lord Edmund Voss, who ruled a small pack far from the political center of the kingdom, a pack too minor to matter to anyone important. He had sent all 3 daughters to the selection, not because he believed any of them had a true chance, but because a pack lord who did not send his daughters would be seen as disrespectful to the crown. It was duty, not hope, that had put Illyra in this carriage. She did not mind. She had never imagined herself standing before the Alpha King. She had never imagined herself standing before anyone, really. Her whole life, she had existed at the edges of rooms, the edges of conversations, the edges of her own family. The carriage slowed as it reached the outer gates of the royal grounds. Guards in dark uniforms checked names against long scrolls. Illyra watched through the window as young women stepped down from carriages all around them, each one more beautiful than the last, each one dressed in silk and jewels that caught the sunlight like captured stars. "Look at them," Meredith whispered, suddenly nervous despite her earlier confidence. "There must be hundreds." "All the more reason the king will not waste time looking twice at some of us," Cassia said, though her eyes lingered a moment too long on Illyra when she said it. They stepped down from the carriage one by one. Illyra came last, her simple gray dress a plain shadow beside her sister's bright colors. She had chosen the gray dress herself, not because she thought it would help her chances, but because it was the only dress she owned that did not remind her of being laughed at. It was safe. It was quiet. It was, in its own way, exactly like her. Lady Miriam looked her youngest daughter over once, her mouth tightening. "Illyra, did you not have anything better?" "This is what I have, mother." "Well, stand where you are told, and do not draw attention to yourself. This is Cassia's day, perhaps Meredith's, if the king has strange taste." She said it without cruelty, which somehow made it worse. It was not an insult meant to wound. It was simply a fact, spoken the way one might mention the weather. They walked together through the gates, and onto the wide green field where the selection would take place. The ground stretched further than Illyra had imagined, a great open lawn bordered by ancient trees, with a raised stone platform at the far end where the Alpha King would stand. Hundreds of young women were already gathering into long, winding lines, their families clustered nearby, watching with hungry eyes. Illyra felt small beneath the enormous sky, small among the hundreds of hopeful faces, small in a way that had nothing to do with her actual height. She let her sisters walk ahead of her, let her mother follow them, and found her place near the back of one of the long lines, exactly where she had been told to stand. She had heard the stories about Alpha King Draven Ashthorn, of course. Everyone had. He was said to be the strongest alpha the kingdom had seen in 3 generations, a man who had taken the throne young after his father's sudden death, and had ruled with an iron discipline ever since. Some called him cold, some called him fair, no one called him warm. He had never taken a mate. For years the kingdom had whispered about why, whether he simply had not found the right woman, or whether something darker kept him from wanting one at all. The mate selection had been announced only 2 months earlier, a sudden decision that had sent every eligible pack scrambling to prepare their daughters. Alira had no illusions about her chances. She was the youngest of 3, the least remarkable, the daughter her own family found it easiest to forget. She had come because she had to, and she would leave the same way she arrived, unnoticed. The lines began to move slowly forward as the afternoon sun climbed higher. Alira watched from a distance as young women reached the front and were assessed, one, by a tall figure standing at the base of the stone platform. Even from far away, she could feel something in the air change whenever he turned his attention toward a new candidate, a kind of pressure, like the moment before a storm breaks. "That is him," a girl nearby whispered to her friend. "The Alpha King." Alira could not see his face clearly yet, only the shape of him. Broad shoulders beneath a dark coat, dark hair, a stillness in the way he stood that seemed almost unnatural, as if he were carved from the same stone as the platform beneath his boots. Her sisters had moved ahead in a different line, closer to the front, their names called earlier because of their family's modest standing among the northern packs. Alira caught glimpses of them through the crowd, Cassia laughing at something, tossing her golden hair, clearly enjoying the attention of the nobles around her. Meredith stood straighter than Alira had ever seen her stand, practicing what looked like a careful, rehearsed smile. Alira's own line moved forward in slow, patient steps. She watched the sky instead of the platform, watched a hawk circle far above the trees, and let her mind wander somewhere far from this field, far from the weight of hundreds of eyes searching for a queen among them. She did not notice, at first, the strange feeling building low in her chest. A warmth, faint but unmistakable, like a small flame lit somewhere deep inside her, that had not been there an hour before. She pressed a hand to her sternum, frowning, wondering if she was simply nervous, or tired, or hungry from the long carriage ride. The feeling did not fade. If anything, it grew stronger the closer her line crept toward the platform. By the time the sun had begun to lower toward the treetops, Alira could see the Alpha King more clearly. He was younger than she had expected, though his expression carried none of the softness of youth. His eyes were a striking shade of gold, sharp and assessing, moving across each candidate before him, with the same detached precision, as though he were reading a report rather than meeting a person. He said little. Most candidates received only a glance, a nod, sometimes a single question, before being waved aside for the next. Alira watched Cassia reach the front of her line. Her sister curtsied low, her golden dress pooling around her like sunlight. The king looked at her for a long moment, longer than he had looked at most, and Alira's stomach tightened without her understanding why. But then he simply nodded, the same nod he had given a dozen others, and moved his gaze to the next candidate. Cassia's face flickered with disappointment before she recovered her composure and stepped aside. Meredith fared little better. She was asked one question, what her name was, and answered with practiced grace, but the king's attention had already begun to drift toward the next woman in line, before she finished speaking. Alira's line moved closer. She counted the women ahead of her. 12, then 9, then 5. The warmth in her chest had grown into something closer to an ache, a pulling sensation that made no sense to her, as if some invisible thread were tugging gently at her ribs. "You there," a voice said behind her, sharp and familiar. "Why are you dawdling at the back of the line? Everyone can see you." Alira turned, to find Cassia had circled back through the crowd, apparently unable to resist checking on her youngest sister's inevitable failure. Meredith trailed behind her, arms crossed. "I am simply waiting my turn," Alira said quietly. "Waiting your turn for what exactly?" Cassia's voice carried further than Alira would have liked, drawing a few curious glances from nearby families. "You do not actually think the king will look twice at you, do you? Look at yourself. That dress, that hair. You blend into the grass, Alira. You always have." A ripple of laughter moved through a small cluster of nobles standing nearby, drawn by Cassia's raised voice. Alira felt her face grow hot, the old familiar sting rising in her throat. She had endured this 1,000 times before, in 1,000 smaller rooms. It should not have hurt any more than it usually did. But something about today, the crowd, the stakes, the strange warmth still pulsing in her chest, made the words land harder than usual. Perhaps you should step out of the line before the king sees you and loses his appetite for the rest of the day, Cassia continued, warming to her own cruelty the way she always did when she had an audience. Save yourself the shame, little sister. Alira felt her eyes sting and hated herself for it. She had promised herself, years ago, that she would not cry in front of her sisters again. She looked down at the trampled grass beneath her plain gray shoes, and for a moment, she truly considered stepping out of the line, walking back through the crowd, finding a quiet corner of the grounds to wait out the rest of the day until her family was ready to leave. But the ache in her chest would not let her move. It was strange, almost frightening, the way it held her in place, as though some force, stronger than her own will, had rooted her feet to the ground. She looked up at the stone platform in the distance, at the tall, still figure of the Alpha King standing among the last few candidates of the day, and the ache pulled tighter, sharper, undeniable. Alira. Her mother's voice cut through the moment, low and warning. Do not make a scene. Step back. Let your sisters pass, and wait for the line to move. I am not making a scene, Alira said, though her voice came out smaller than she intended. Cassia rolled her eyes and turned to walk away with Meredith at her side, already whispering to each other, already laughing about something Alira could not hear and did not want to. Her mother lingered a moment longer, studying her youngest daughter with an expression Alira could not quite read. Not concern, not quite indifference, something caught uncomfortably between the two. Do not embarrass this family, her mother said finally, before turning to follow her other daughters back toward the front of the crowd, where the best view of the platform could be found. Alira stood alone again, the warmth in her chest now a steady, insistent pull, like a hand reaching out from somewhere she could not see, drawing her forward one small step at a time, as the line inched toward the platform. She did not understand it. She only knew that whatever was happening inside her, it had nothing to do with her sister's laughter, and everything to do with the man standing at the front of the crowd, whose golden eyes had not yet found her, but somehow, she was certain, would. The line moved again. 3 women left, then 2. Alira's heart pounded so loudly she was certain the woman standing beside her could hear it. She smoothed the front of her plain gray dress with trembling hands, aware suddenly of every flaw she had never bothered to notice before. The slight fray at her sleeve, the plainness of her unstyled hair, the absence of any jewel or ornament to mark her as someone worth looking at. It did not matter, she told herself. In a moment, she would step forward, receive a nod like all the others, and step aside. This would be over quickly. She would find her family after, endure the ride home, and never think of this field again. One woman left in front of her. The Alpha King's gaze passed briefly over the crowd as he waited for the next candidate to step forward, and for one impossible second, Alira was certain his eyes caught on her, really caught, not the passing glance he had given every other woman that day, but something sharper, something that made the ache in her chest flare into something close to pain. Then the moment broke as the woman in front of her stepped up to be assessed, and the king's attention shifted away, and Alira told herself she had imagined it. Of course she had imagined it. Wishful thinking, cruel and useless, planted by a strange and unexplainable feeling she did not understand. She took a slow breath and prepared to step forward when her own turn came, certain of exactly how this day would end. She had never been more wrong about anything in her life. The final candidate ahead of Alira stepped up to the platform, curtsied, answered a brief question about her family's pack, and was waved aside like all the rest. Alira watched the king's face carefully now, searching for any sign of what she thought she had seen a moment ago. His expression gave nothing away. He looked, if anything, tired. The particular exhaustion of a man who had spent an entire day looking for something he was beginning to believe he would not find. Then it was her turn. Alira stepped forward onto the worn grass path leading to the base of the platform, aware of every eye that might be watching, though she did not dare look for her family in the crowd. She kept her gaze low, the way she had been taught, and dropped into a small, careful curtsy. "Name," said a voice beside the king, an advisor, an older man with a neat gray beard and a scroll in his hands, clearly tasked with recording each candidate as she passed. "Illyra Voss," she said, "of the Voss Pack, in the Northern Hills." The advisor made a note without looking up. It was, Illyra thought, exactly how the entire day had gone. A name, a note, a step aside. But the king had not looked away. Illyra felt it before she saw it. A shift in the air around her. A stillness that had not been there a moment ago. She lifted her eyes, only slightly. Only enough to see that Alpha King Draven Ashthorn was no longer looking through her the way he had looked through every candidate before her. He was looking at her. Really looking. His golden eyes had narrowed, his jaw had tightened, and something in his broad shoulders had gone rigid, as though he had been struck by something no one else in the crowd could see. The advisor beside him, still writing, did not notice the change. The nearby nobles, murmuring among themselves about the lateness of the hour, did not notice either. But Illyra noticed, and for the first time all day, the strange warmth in her chest did not feel like an ache. It felt like recognition. For a long moment, no one moved. Illyra stood frozen at the base of the platform, uncertain if she should look away, uncertain what she had done to draw such a stare from a man who had spent the entire day treating every candidate the same way. Then Draven Ashthorn took a single step forward, off the platform, closer to her than any candidate had been allowed all day. The advisor finally looked up from his scroll, startled. "Your Majesty?" Draven did not answer him. His eyes stayed fixed on Illyra, studying her face, her posture, the plain gray dress she had chosen, because it made her feel invisible. It was not working now. She had never felt more visible in her life. "Say your name again," he said. His voice was low, rougher than she expected, carrying an edge of something she could not name. Not anger. Not quite. "Illyra," she said, her own voice barely above a whisper. "Illyra Voss." He inhaled slowly, as though testing the air itself, and something in his expression shifted from confusion to certainty. Behind Illyra, murmurs began to spread through the crowd, curious whispers rippling outward, as more and more people noticed that the king had stopped moving through the line the way he had all day. Somewhere in that crowd, Illyra knew, her mother and sisters were watching. She did not dare turn to look for them. "Where is the rest of your family?" Draven asked. Before Illyra could answer, a familiar voice rang out from the crowd, bright and eager. "Your Majesty." Cassia stepped forward, pulling Meredith along with her, both women dropping into elegant curtsies a respectful distance away. "We are the Voss sisters. I am Cassia, the eldest. This is our sister Meredith. And this," she gestured vaguely toward Illyra, her smile tightening at the edges, "is our youngest sister. I do apologize if she has caused any delay. She can be terribly shy." Draven's gaze flicked briefly to Cassia, then to Meredith, and Illyra watched something cool and unreadable pass behind his golden eyes. It was nothing like the intensity with which he had looked at her a moment ago. "You mistake my meaning," he said, his voice carrying easily across the quieting crowd. "I did not ask because I doubted her family existed. I asked because I intend to speak with them." Cassia's smile faltered, just slightly, though she recovered quickly. "Of course, Your Majesty. Our mother is just there, near the front of the—" "Bring her forward," Draven said. Then, to the advisor beside him, "Stop the line." The advisor blinked. "Your Majesty, there are still candidates waiting to be—" "Stop the line," Draven repeated, and something in his tone made it clear this was not a request. The advisor snapped the scroll shut and raised a hand, signaling to the guards positioned along the edges of the field. Within moments, the long lines of waiting women had gone still, a wave of confused murmurs spreading across the entire grounds as word passed backward through the crowd that the king had halted the selection. Illyra felt her heart pounding so hard she thought it might be visible through her dress. She did not understand what was happening, only that everything around her had shifted, quietly and completely, the moment the king's eyes had first found hers. Lady Miriam Voss arrived a moment later, slightly out of breath, her expression caught between confusion and barely concealed hope. She curtsied deeply before the king. "Your Majesty, I am Lady Miriam Voss, mother to these three. Has something happened?" Draven did not answer her directly. Instead, he turned back to Alira, studying her the way a man might study something he had spent years searching for without knowing its name. "Do you know what a mate bond feels like?" he asked her quietly, though the stillness of the crowd around them meant his words carried further than perhaps he intended. Alira shook her head slowly. She had heard stories, of course, the way every child in the kingdom heard stories about fated mates, about the invisible thread that was said to connect two souls destined for each other. She had never expected to feel anything like it herself. She had never expected anyone to look at her the way Draven Ashthorn was looking at her now. "It feels," Draven said, his voice lower now, meant only for her, though the crowd strained to hear regardless. "Like the first time you take a full breath after holding it for years. It feels like something you did not know was missing, suddenly falling into place." Alira's chest tightened. The ache she had felt all afternoon, the strange warmth that had pulled her forward step by step through the line, despite her sister's cruelty, despite her own certainty that this day would end the same way it always did. She understood now, with a clarity that left her breathless, exactly what it had been. "I felt it," she admitted quietly. "I did not know what it was." A murmur of astonishment rippled through the gathered crowd. Somewhere behind her, Alira heard Cassia's sharp intake of breath, though she did not turn to look. She could not look away from the king's face, from the golden eyes that had found her among hundreds of hopeful candidates and had not looked away since. "Then you understand," Draven said, "that I have found what I came here to find." The crowd had gone completely silent now, save for the rustle of wind through the trees at the edge of the grounds. Every eye on the field was fixed on the small space between the Alpha King and the youngest daughter of a minor northern pack lord, a girl no one had expected to matter at all. Lady Miriam recovered her composure first. "Your Majesty, forgive me, but surely there has been some confusion. Elira is our youngest, and while she is a sweet girl, I am certain my eldest daughter Cassia would be far better suited to." "There is no confusion," Draven said, his voice carrying the calm, absolute authority of a man who had never once in his life been made to repeat himself. "A mate bond does not form out of suitability, Lady Voss. It does not care for beauty, or rank, or which daughter your family hoped would wear a crown. It simply is. And it has chosen your daughter Alira." Cassia stepped forward, her composure cracking now, her voice sharper than she likely intended. "Your Majesty, with respect, are you certain? Alira has never. She is not. Perhaps the bond is confused. Perhaps it was meant for one of us, and simply mistook." "Mate bonds do not make mistakes," Draven said simply, cutting through her protest without raising his voice. "I have stood on this platform since sunrise, meeting more candidates than I can count. Not one of them stirred anything in me. Then your sister stepped forward, and I felt something I have never felt before in my life. I do not need to explain myself further, but I will say this once, clearly, so there is no room left for confusion. Alira Voss is my fated mate." The words landed across the crowd like a stone dropped into still water, ripples of astonished whispers spreading outward in every direction. Alira felt herself trembling, though she could not have said whether it was from shock or disbelief, or something warmer and far more frightening, hope, perhaps, a feeling so unfamiliar to her that she almost did not recognize it. Meredith, who had said nothing until now, finally found her voice, though it came out thin and unsteady. "This cannot be right. She has always been the quiet one, the forgotten one. Surely a king deserves someone who has been groomed for this. Someone who has been groomed to want a crown is not the same as someone whose soul recognizes mine," Draven said, and for the first time, a flicker of something colder passed across his expression, as his gaze moved from Meredith back to Alira, taking in, perhaps for the first time, the plainness of her dress, the modesty of her bearing, the way she stood slightly apart even now, as though still expecting to be pushed aside. "Tell me," he said quietly, addressing Alira directly now. His voice softened just enough that it felt, despite the hundreds of watching eyes, almost private. "Is it often like this, your family speaking over you, even now?" Alira did not know how to answer. A lifetime of instinct told her to deflect, to smooth things over, to protect her family from the king's obvious displeasure, the way she had always tried to keep the peace at home. But something about the steadiness of his gaze made honesty feel possible in a way it never had before. Often enough, she admitted softly. Draven's jaw tightened, and though he said nothing further on the matter in that moment, Illyra sensed that her simple answer had told him everything he needed to know. He turned back to the advisor, who was still standing frozen, with his scroll clutched to his chest, clearly uncertain how to proceed with a selection that had upended itself so completely. "Record it," Draven said. "Illyra Voss, of the Voss Pack, confirmed mate to the crown." The advisor scrambled to obey, his pen scratching quickly across the parchment. Around the field, the hundreds of other candidates who had traveled so far, hoped so much, and prepared so carefully for this day, began to understand, in slow and quiet realization, that the selection was over before most of them had even reached the platform. Illyra barely registered any of it. She was still staring at Draven, still trying to make sense of a day that had begun with her sisters mocking her in a carriage, and was somehow ending with the most powerful man in the kingdom, declaring her his mate in front of everyone she had ever known. "I do not understand," she said quietly, the words slipping out before she could stop them. "Why me?" Something in Draven's expression softened, just slightly, the coldness that had settled there when addressing her sisters giving way to something gentler when he looked at her again. "That is not a question fate answers with reasons," he said. "It simply answers with certainty, and I have never been more certain of anything." Behind them, Cassia's face had gone pale, her earlier mockery from the carriage ride now hanging heavy and unspoken in the air between the sisters. Illyra did not need to say anything to know that her sister remembered every cruel word she had spoken that morning, every joke made at Illyra's expense in front of an audience that had laughed along without a second thought. None of them were laughing now. Draven extended a hand toward her, an invitation rather than a command, though the entire field watched to see what she would do. Illyra looked down at his open palm, then up at his face, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she did not feel like the invisible daughter standing at the edge of a room. She felt like someone worth looking at. Slowly, she placed her hand in his. His hand closed around hers, warm and steady, and the moment their skin touched, the ache in her chest that had plagued her all afternoon finally settled into something calm and whole, like a missing piece, sliding into place after years of searching. Illyra gasped softly at the sensation, and across the field, she saw Draven's own composure flicker for just a moment, as though he had felt it too. "You feel it as well," he said, not quite a question. "Yes," Illyra whispered. The crowd around them had begun to shift, whispers turning to open conversation, as families who had traveled from every corner of the kingdom realized the day's outcome had already been decided, and decided in a way none of them had predicted. Illyra caught fragments of conversation drifting past, disbelief, envy, curiosity. But none of it seemed to matter as much as the warmth still spreading through her hand, where Draven's fingers held hers. "There will be a great deal to arrange," Draven said, turning his attention briefly to the advisor still hovering nearby. "Formal announcements, a proper introduction to the court, but first," he looked back at Illyra, and something almost gentle crossed his sharp features. "I think you should have a moment to simply understand what has happened today, without an audience of hundreds watching you do it." He raised a hand, and 2 guards in dark royal uniforms stepped forward from the edge of the platform. "Escort Lady Illyra to the Eastern Hall. See that she has anything she requires. I will join her shortly, once the grounds are cleared." Illyra glanced back once, toward her family, before the guards led her away. Her mother's face had settled into something unreadable, caught between pride at the sudden elevation of her family's name and clear discomfort at how it had come to pass. Meredith would not meet her eyes at all. And Cassia stood very still, her earlier confidence entirely gone, replaced by something Illyra had never seen on her sister's face before. It looked almost like fear. Illyra did not have time to wonder what her sister might be afraid of. The guards guided her gently across the grounds, past hundreds of curious eyes, past whispered conversations that stopped the moment she drew near, until they reached a quiet stone hallway on the eastern edge of the royal grounds, far from the noise of the dispersing crowd. The hallway was cool and dim after the bright afternoon sun, lined with tall windows that let in soft golden light. A young woman in a simple uniform hurried forward to greet her, offering a small curtsy. "Lady Illyra," she said, sounding slightly breathless, as though she had run to meet them. "I am Nora. I have been asked to see to your comfort. Please, this way." Elira followed her into a small sitting room, its walls lined with tall bookshelves, a low fire already burning in the hearth, despite the mild afternoon. Nora gestured toward a soft chair near the window and busied herself pouring a cup of warm tea from a kettle set nearby. "Is it true?" Nora asked, unable to fully hide her curiosity, as she handed Elira the cup. "That the king found his mate today?" "I believe so," Elira said quietly, still turning the cup slowly in her hands, still trying to convince herself that the events of the past hour had truly happened and were not some strange, impossible dream. "Though I am still trying to understand it myself." Nora smiled, a genuine warm expression that felt like the first uncomplicated kindness Elira had received all day. "Well, whoever you are, whatever brought you here, the whole kingdom will know your name by morning." Elira looked down at her plain gray dress, thought of the carriage ride that morning, of her sister's laughter, of a lifetime spent being told, in 100 small ways, that she did not matter enough to be seen. "I am not sure I know how to be someone whose name matters," she admitted softly. Nora's expression gentled. "From what I saw on that field, my lady, I think you are about to learn quickly." Outside the tall windows, the sun continued its slow descent toward the horizon, casting long golden light across the royal grounds where, not far away, Elira's family stood among the dispersing crowd, grappling with a truth none of them had been prepared to accept: that the daughter they had spent years overlooking had just become the most important woman in the entire kingdom. Draven arrived at the Eastern Hall as the last light of evening painted the sky in shades of amber and rose. He had changed out of the formal coat he had worn for the selection into something simpler, though his presence still filled the small sitting room the moment he stepped through the door. Nora curtsied quickly and slipped out, leaving Elira alone with him for the first time since the field. "You are still wearing the same expression you had an hour ago," Draven observed, settling into the chair across from her, "as though you are waiting for someone to tell you this was all a mistake." "Forgive me," Elira said. "It is difficult to trust something so sudden." "It is not sudden," Draven said. "Not truly. The bond has likely existed since the day you were born. It simply took until today for us to stand close enough for it to make itself known." He studied her for a long moment, his golden eyes thoughtful. "May I ask you something?" Elira nodded. "Your sister mentioned a mark," Draven said carefully. "During the confusion on the field, she called it a birth flaw. Do you know what she meant?" Elira's hand moved instinctively to her right wrist, covering the pale, curved mark that had been there since she was born, a shape like a crescent moon wrapped around a small star, faint enough that it was easily hidden beneath a sleeve or a bit of powder. Her mother had always insisted she keep it covered, calling it an unfortunate blemish, something that might frighten a suitor if seen too plainly. "It has always been there," Elira said quietly, pulling back the fabric of her sleeve to reveal it. "My mother called it a flaw. I stopped asking about it a long time ago." Draven leaned forward, his expression sharpening with sudden intensity as he studied the mark on her wrist. "That is not a flaw," he said slowly. "That is a mate's mark. Every fated match carries one, though they rarely appear before the bond is triggered. Yours appeared at birth, which is exceedingly rare. It means the bond between us was set long before either of us understood what it meant." As he spoke, something strange began to happen. The pale mark on Elira's wrist, which had remained faint and nearly invisible her entire life, began to glow with a soft, golden light, pulsing gently in rhythm with her heartbeat. Elira stared at it in astonishment, unable to speak, as the light grew steadily brighter, illuminating the small sitting room with a warm, unmistakable glow. Draven reached out slowly, as if asking permission, and Elira nodded. He turned her wrist gently in his hand, watching the light pulse beneath his fingers, and when he looked up at her again, something in his expression had changed entirely. The careful distance he had maintained since the field replaced by something far more certain. "This is proof beyond any doubt," he said quietly. "Not that I needed it, but the elders will, and your family will no longer be able to claim confusion." A knock sounded at the door before Elira could respond. An older man entered at Draven's word, dressed in long ceremonial robes marked with the sigils of the royal court, one of the pack elders, tasked with overseeing matters of succession and bonding within the kingdom. He bowed deeply upon entering, then stopped short at the sight of the glowing mark on Elira's wrist. "Your Majesty," the elder said, his voice carrying quiet astonishment. "Is this—" "Confirmed," Draven said. "Illyra Voss carries a mate mark that has been active since birth. I want it recorded, witnessed, and made official before nightfall." The elder approached slowly, studying the glowing crescent and star with the careful attention of a man who had spent decades verifying such bonds. "In all my years, Your Majesty, I have seen perhaps 2 marks that appeared before adulthood, never one from birth. This is—" He paused, searching for the right word. "This is a bond written by fate itself, long before either of you could have chosen it." Illyra listened to the elder's words with a strange, quiet ache building in her chest. Not the ache of the bond this time, but something older and more familiar. A lifetime of being told the mark on her wrist was something to hide, something shameful, when in truth, it had been the clearest sign imaginable that she was meant for something far greater than the corner of a room. "My mother always told me to cover it," Illyra said softly, almost to herself. Draven's jaw tightened at that. The same flicker of cold anger she had seen on the field returning to his expression. "Then your mother hid the truth of your worth for 18 years, he said. Whether she understood what she was hiding or not. The elder cleared his throat gently. "Your Majesty, if I may, the girl's family remains on the grounds, awaiting word. Given the nature of this confirmation, it would be wise to summon them formally, so that the bond may be witnessed, and no future doubt can be raised." Draven looked at Illyra, a silent question in his eyes, as though asking whether she was ready to face her family again so soon. Illyra thought of the carriage ride that morning, of Cassia's laughter, of her mother's quiet dismissal, and found, to her own surprise, that she was not afraid. "I am ready," she said. Draven nodded once, satisfied, and turned to the elder. "Bring them in." A few minutes later, the door opened again, and Illyra's family entered the sitting room, ushered in by a pair of quiet guards. Lady Miriam led the way, her expression carefully composed, though Illyra could see the tension in the set of her shoulders. Cassia and Meredith followed behind, both noticeably subdued from the confident, laughing women who had ridden in the carriage that morning. "Your Majesty," Lady Miriam said, offering a deep curtsy, "you summoned us." "I did," Draven said, his voice cool and formal now, every trace of the gentleness he had shown Illyra moments earlier, replaced by the authority of a ruler addressing a matter of state. "The elder here has confirmed what I already knew on the field. Illyra carries an active mate mark, one that has been present since her birth. I want no confusion to remain about what that means." He gestured, and Illyra, feeling suddenly exposed despite the small room, extended her wrist so the golden light of the mark could be seen clearly. Lady Miriam's eyes widened, her carefully composed expression faltering for the first time. Meredith let out a small, involuntary gasp. Cassia said nothing at all, her face pale as she stared at the glowing mark her sister had kept hidden beneath her sleeve for 18 years. "That mark has been there her whole life," the elder confirmed, his voice grave. "Which means this bond was never in question. It could not have belonged to any other daughter in this family." "I did not know," Lady Miriam said quietly, though something in her tone suggested she was speaking as much to convince herself as anyone else in the room. "I always thought it was simply a blemish. I told her to cover it so that it would not affect her prospects." "You told her to hide the very proof of her worth," Draven said, "because you assumed she had none to begin with." Lady Miriam had no answer for that. The silence stretched, heavy and uncomfortable, until Cassia finally spoke, her voice smaller than Illyra had ever heard it. "I did not know either," she said. "I swear it. I only ever saw her as—" She stopped herself, glancing briefly at Illyra before looking away, unable to finish the sentence. "As someone unworthy of notice," Illyra finished quietly, not with anger, but with the plain, tired honesty of someone who had spent a lifetime hearing the unfinished half of that sentence in 100 different forms. Cassia flinched, but did not deny it. Draven's gaze moved slowly across the 3 women, his expression hardening further with each passing moment. "I will be honest with you," he said. "It would be well within my right, as king, to consider how a family treats my mate before this bond became known, and to weigh that treatment carefully when deciding what place, if any, that family holds at my court going forward." Lady Miriam's composure finally cracked. "Your Majesty, please, we meant no true harm. Sibling teasing is common in every household. Surely you understand. I understand cruelty when I see its results, Draven said, cutting her off without raising his voice. I understand a young woman who flinched at the sound of her own family's laughter, long before she ever stepped onto that field today. I understand a mark hidden for 18 years, because her own mother assumed it marked her as flawed rather than chosen. He paused, his golden eyes settling on Alira, softening only slightly. But this decision is not mine alone to make. Alira has endured your treatment far longer than I have witnessed it. If anyone in this room has the right to decide what happens next, it is her. The room fell silent. Every eye turned toward Alira, her mother's pleading, her sister's fear, the elder's quiet patience, and Draven's steady, waiting gaze. For the first time in her entire life, Alira Voss held real power over the people who had spent years deciding, without ever asking her, exactly how much space she was allowed to take up in the world. She thought of the carriage ride that morning, of Cassia's laughter echoing through the crowd, of her mother's quiet instruction to stand at the back and not embarrass the family. She thought of 18 years spent believing she was simply less beautiful, less clever, less worthy of love, because the people who should have told her otherwise had never bothered to look closely enough to see the truth. And yet, standing here now, with the weight of an entire kingdom's attention suddenly resting on her, Alira did not feel the urge to lash out the way she might once have imagined, in her darkest, most private moments, that she would if given the chance. I do not want revenge, she said quietly, though her voice carried clearly in the small room. I have spent too many years being small to want to become someone who makes others small in return. Draven watched her carefully, something unreadable moving behind his golden eyes. But, Alira continued, straightening slightly, feeling something steady and new settling into her chest, I also do not intend to spend the rest of my life pretending the last 18 years did not happen. I will not stand at the back anymore. Not for you, she said, looking at her mother, and not for either of you, she added, glancing at her sisters. If I am to be queen, then I will be queen fully, without apology, and without shrinking myself to make anyone in this room more comfortable. A long silence followed her words. Lady Miriam's eyes glistened, though whether from shame or something closer to belated pride, Alira could not tell. Cassia stared at the floor. Meredith, for the first time all day, looked genuinely uncertain, as though seeing her youngest sister clearly for the very first time. Draven finally broke the silence, his voice quieter now, though no less firm. Then it is decided. Alira Voss will be announced formally as my chosen mate and future queen within the week. Her family will be permitted to attend the ceremony, provided they conduct themselves with the respect her position now demands. He turned to the elder. See that the proper preparations begin immediately. The elder bowed and departed. Lady Miriam, Cassia, and Meredith lingered a moment longer, clearly uncertain what to say, before finally offering shallow, uneasy curtsies and following the elder out of the room, leaving Alira alone once more, with the man whose golden eyes had somehow, impossibly, chosen her above every other woman in the kingdom. That was well spoken, Draven said quietly, once the door had closed behind them. I did not know I had it in me, Alira admitted. I suspect, Draven said, a small, unfamiliar warmth creeping into his voice, that you have had far more in you than anyone in your family ever cared to notice. The days that followed passed in a blur Alira could hardly keep track of. She was moved from the Eastern Hall to a set of private chambers within the royal residence itself, rooms far grander than anything she had known in her family's modest northern home. Tall windows looked out over gardens she had only ever read about in old storybooks, and a small army of attendants appeared each morning to help her prepare for a life she was still struggling to believe was truly hers. Nora remained close by throughout those first days, a steady, familiar presence amid the overwhelming newness of court life. It was Nora who explained the customs Alira would be expected to know, who helped her practice the careful etiquette of royal gatherings, and who, more importantly, simply sat with her in quiet moments when the weight of everything threatened to become too much. You are allowed to feel overwhelmed, Nora told her one evening, as they sat together near the fire in Alira's new chambers. Everyone would be, in your place. It is not the crown that overwhelms me, Alira admitted. It is the sudden absence of the voice that used to tell me I did not belong somewhere. Nora smiled gently. Perhaps it is simply quiet enough now for you to hear a different voice instead. Alira thought about that long after Nora had gone, staring out at the moonlit gardens beyond her window, wondering what it might feel like to spend a lifetime without the constant hum of her own smallness following her from room to room. Draven visited her chambers most evenings, though their conversations remained careful, almost formal at first. Two strangers, bound together by a fate neither of them had chosen, but both were slowly learning to accept. He told her, in small pieces over several nights, of his own childhood, the sudden loss of his father, the crushing weight of a throne inherited far too young, the years spent proving himself worthy of a position he had never asked for. "I understand, in some strange way, what it is to feel unseen," he admitted one evening, staring into the fire rather than at her. "Not in the way you experienced it. But there were years when every person around me saw only the crown, never the boy wearing it." "And now?" Alira asked quietly. "Now," Draven said, finally meeting her eyes, "I find myself looking forward to the moments when someone finally looks past all of it and simply sees me. I had begun to believe that person did not exist. Then you stepped forward on that field, and I felt, for the first time in years, truly known." Alira found herself, more and more with each passing evening, looking forward to those quiet conversations by the fire, the slow unfolding of a bond that had announced itself so suddenly on the selection field but was, she was beginning to understand, something that would take real time and real effort to grow into something lasting. Word of the king's chosen mate spread quickly across the kingdom in the days that followed. Alira received curious, sometimes skeptical glances whenever she walked the halls of the royal residence. Courtiers who had expected the selection to end with a candidate of higher standing, now forced to reconsider their assumptions about the quiet daughter of a minor northern pack. Some were kind, others were less so, their whispered doubts carrying just far enough for Alira to hear as she passed. "They will not all accept me easily," she said to Draven one evening, after a particularly difficult encounter with a group of noblewomen who had made little effort to hide their surprise at her plain manner of speech. "They do not need to accept you easily," Draven said. "They only need to accept you eventually. And they will, once they see what I already see." "And what is that?" He considered the question for a long moment, his golden eyes thoughtful in the firelight. "Someone who has spent her whole life being underestimated and has never once let it make her cruel in return. That is rarer than any beauty this court has ever crowned, Alira. Rarer and far more valuable." Alira did not know how to respond to that, so she simply let the warmth of his words settle over her, quiet and steady, the way the fire warmed the room around them. Her family, meanwhile, remained at the royal residence as guests, though their presence had grown noticeably quieter since the confrontation in the Eastern Hall. Lady Miriam attempted, on more than one occasion, to re-establish the easy authority she had once held over her youngest daughter, offering unsolicited advice about court behavior or proper posture. Alira found, with each attempt, that she was slowly growing more comfortable, simply declining the advice, thanking her mother politely, and continuing on with whatever she had been doing before the interruption. It was a small kind of power, she realized. Not the power of a crown, not yet. Simply the power of a woman who had finally stopped waiting for her family's approval before deciding how to carry herself through the world. Cassia, surprisingly, proved the more difficult adjustment. Where Meredith had retreated into quiet, uncertain politeness, Cassia seemed to be waging some private battle within herself, caught between old habits of dismissiveness and a dawning, uncomfortable awareness of how deeply those habits had wounded the sister she had spent years mocking without a second thought. "I do not know how to speak to you now," Cassia admitted one afternoon, finding Alira alone in the palace gardens. "Everything I would normally say feels wrong." "Perhaps that is because it always was wrong," Alira said, not unkindly, simply honestly. "You simply never had a reason to notice before." Cassia was quiet for a long moment, staring at the neatly trimmed hedges surrounding them. "I am sorry," she said finally, the words clearly unfamiliar in her mouth. "I do not expect you to forgive me easily. I only wanted you to know that I see it now. All of it. The carriage, the line. Years before that, if I am honest with myself." Alira studied her sister's face, searching for the mockery that had colored every interaction between them, for as long as she could remember, and found, for the first time, something that looked almost like genuine remorse. "I appreciate you saying it," Elira said carefully. "But saying it is only the beginning, Cassia. If you truly see it now, show me. Not with words, with time." Cassia nodded slowly, and though their relationship remained fragile and uncertain in the days that followed, Elira noticed small changes: a gentler tone during shared meals, a genuine question about Elira's growing responsibilities, rather than a dismissive comment, small steps that suggested her sister might, given enough time, become someone worth trusting again. Meredith's path proved quieter still. She said little, but Elira caught her, more than once, watching from a distance during court gatherings, with an expression that looked less like envy and more like quiet reflection, as though she were slowly reconsidering years of assumptions she had never thought to question before. As the days passed, preparations for the formal announcement ceremony grew steadily more elaborate. The entire royal residence buzzed with activity, tailors measuring Elira for gowns finer than anything she had ever imagined wearing, advisors briefing her on the customs and expectations of her new position, and Draven, steady and present through it all, ensuring she was never made to face the overwhelming transformation of her life entirely alone. "Are you ready?" he asked her, the evening before the ceremony was set to take place, as they stood together on a quiet balcony, overlooking the palace grounds. Elira considered the question honestly. She thought of the girl who had ridden in that carriage weeks ago, certain the day would end in quiet humiliation. She thought of the ache in her chest that had pulled her forward through the line, despite her sister's cruelty. She thought of the golden mark on her wrist, hidden for 18 years, finally allowed to shine. "I think," she said slowly, "that I have been ready for a very long time. I simply did not know it until now." Draven reached for her hand, the same way he had on the selection field weeks earlier, and Elira felt the same warm, steady certainty settle through her at his touch. "Tomorrow," he said quietly, "the entire kingdom will see what I already know. That you were never the daughter to overlook. You were simply waiting for the right eyes to finally look closely enough to see you." The morning of the ceremony arrived bright and clear. The entire royal residence transformed overnight into something out of the storybooks Elira had read as a child. Banners bearing the royal crest hung from every tower, and the great hall had been prepared to hold not only the court, but representatives from every major pack across the kingdom, all gathered to witness the formal announcement of the Alpha King's chosen mate. Elira stood in her private chambers as Nora fastened the final clasp of her gown, a deep emerald fabric that caught the morning light in ways her old plain dresses never had. She barely recognized her own reflection in the tall mirror before her, not because the gown had transformed her into someone else, but because, for the first time, she was finally allowed to look like exactly who she had always been beneath the years of careful smallness. "You look every bit a queen," Nora said softly, adjusting a final strand of Elira's hair. "I still feel like the girl from the carriage," Elira admitted. "Perhaps," Nora said, meeting her eyes in the mirror. "That girl and this queen have always been the same person. The rest of the world simply had not caught up yet." A knock came at the door, and one of the palace guards entered to announce that the ceremony was ready to begin. Elira took a slow breath, steadying the nervous flutter in her chest, and followed the guard through the winding halls of the residence toward the great hall. The moment the doors opened before her, a wall of sound and color washed over her. Hundreds of nobles gathered in their finest attire, the low hum of conversation falling away almost instantly as every head turned toward the entrance. At the far end of the hall, standing upon a raised dais beneath the banners of the crown, Draven waited, his golden eyes finding hers across the crowded room, with the same unerring certainty they had shown on the selection field weeks earlier. Elira walked the long length of the hall alone, her family seated near the front among the gathered nobility, her sisters watching with expressions far softer than they had worn a month ago. She kept her eyes fixed on Draven as she walked, letting the steady warmth of the bond between them carry her forward, one measured step at a time, until she reached the base of the dais and climbed to stand beside him. The elder who had confirmed her mark weeks earlier stepped forward to address the crowd, his voice carrying easily through the vast hall. "Long has this kingdom waited for its Alpha King to find his fated match," he began. "Long have the old stories told us that such a bond, once found, would announce itself with certainty, no one could deny. Today, we gather to witness the truth of those stories, made real in the presence of Illyra Voss. A murmur of anticipation moved through the crowd as the elder gestured for Illyra to extend her wrist. The soft golden glow of her mate mark shone clearly for all to see, drawing gasps of astonishment from those who had not yet witnessed it firsthand. But before the ceremony could continue, a sharp voice rang out from among the gathered nobles, cutting through the reverent silence. "Forgive the interruption, Your Majesty, but I must ask, how can the court be certain this mark is genuine, and not some clever deception arranged to secure a crown for a family with little else to recommend it?" The voice belonged to a tall, sharply dressed noblewoman near the front of the crowd, a member of one of the kingdom's oldest and most influential packs, whose own daughter had been among the candidates at the selection weeks earlier. A ripple of uncertain murmurs spread through the hall at her words, old doubts resurfacing despite the elder's earlier confirmation. Draven's expression hardened instantly, though he raised a hand before the elder could respond, signaling that he would answer the challenge himself. "Lady Ashford," he said, his voice carrying easily across the silent hall, cool and unmistakably firm. "I understand doubt. I understand the desire for certainty in matters as significant as the crown's succession, but I will not stand here and allow the authenticity of this bond to be questioned twice in 1 month." He turned to the elder. "Explain, once more, and clearly, for those who require further convincing." The elder bowed and addressed the crowd. "The mark before you appeared at Lady Illyra's birth, 18 years before this bond was triggered. Such marks cannot be forged, cannot be painted, and cannot be summoned by any means known to pack magic or common deception. I have examined it personally, alongside 2 other senior elders of the court, and all 3 of us confirm without reservation that this bond is genuine and absolute." Lady Ashford's expression tightened, clearly unsatisfied but unwilling to press the matter further against the combined authority of the king and 3 senior elders. She offered a stiff, shallow curtsy and fell silent, though Illyra could feel the weight of continued skepticism lingering in the air around her. Draven, however, was not finished. He turned to address the full hall, his voice carrying a new edge of steel Illyra had not heard from him before. "Let me be clear. To Lady Ashford, and to anyone else in this hall who harbors similar doubts," he said, "this bond was not chosen by me, nor manufactured by Illyra's family, nor arranged through any political calculation. It was written by fate before either of us understood what it meant. I did not select Illyra Voss because it was convenient. I selected her because I had no choice in the matter at all. The bond had already made the choice for both of us, long before I ever stood upon that field." He paused, letting his words settle over the silent hall, before continuing, quieter now, though no less firm. "What I do have a choice in," he said, "is how I treat the woman fate has given me, and I choose, fully and without hesitation, to honor her, to protect her, and to ensure that no one in this kingdom, noble or common, family or stranger, ever again mistakes her worth, simply because she was once too quiet to demand the recognition she deserved." A long silence followed his words, and then, slowly, applause began to ripple through the hall, spreading outward until the entire gathered court had risen to their feet in acknowledgement. Even Lady Ashford, though her expression remained guarded, offered a reluctant, respectful nod. Illyra felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, though she blinked them back, unwilling to let this moment blur before she had fully lived it. Beside her, Draven reached for her hand once more, steady and certain, and together, they turned to face the crowd as the elder raised his voice to complete the formal announcement. "By the authority of the ancient bond, witnessed and confirmed before this court, I present to you Illyra Voss, chosen mate of Alpha King Draven Ashthorn, and future queen of this kingdom." The great hall erupted into applause, and for the first time in her entire life, Illyra Voss stood at the very center of a room, seen fully, seen completely, by everyone within it. In the days following the announcement, a quieter matter remained unresolved, one that Draven had chosen not to address publicly during the ceremony, but had made clear to Illyra he intended to settle before the wedding itself took place. He summoned Lady Miriam, Cassia, and Meredith to a private meeting in one of the smaller council rooms, away from the eyes of the wider court, though Illyra noted the seriousness with which the guards positioned themselves at the door. I have given considerable thought to how this family should be treated going forward, Draven began, once all three women had taken their seats across from him. As king, it would be well within my authority to strip your family's standing entirely, given the treatment Alira endured under your roof for 18 years. Many in my position would consider such a response entirely justified. Lady Miriam's face paled, though she said nothing, clearly bracing herself for whatever judgment was about to follow. Cassia's hands twisted anxiously in her lap. Meredith stared at the floor. However, Draven continued, I promised Alira that this decision would ultimately be hers to make, not mine. I intend to honor that promise now. He turned to Alira, who sat quietly beside him, her heart pounding as she felt the weight of the moment settle fully onto her shoulders. This was, she realized, the true test of everything she had said in the Eastern Hall weeks ago. The question of whether she truly meant it when she claimed she did not want revenge, or whether that resolve would crumble now that the power to enact it sat so plainly within her reach. She looked at her mother, whose careful composure had finally cracked entirely, revealing something raw and afraid beneath it. She looked at Cassia, whose earlier apology in the garden had been followed, in the weeks since, by small but consistent efforts at genuine kindness. She looked at Meredith, quiet and uncertain, a woman who had spent her whole life following Cassia's lead, without ever fully forming opinions of her own. I have thought about this moment many times since the selection, Alira said slowly, choosing her words with care. I imagined, more than once, what it might feel like to finally have the power to make you understand exactly how you made me feel for so many years. Lady Miriam flinched, but did not interrupt. But I have decided, Alira continued, that stripping my family's standing would not heal the years I spent feeling invisible. It would only prove that power, once gained, is best used to make others feel as small as I once did. I refuse to become someone who believes that. She paused, gathering her thoughts, aware of Draven's steady, patient presence beside her, offering silent support without attempting to influence her decision. Instead, Alira said, I ask for something different. Not punishment, but accountability. My family's standing at court will remain intact, but it will not be elevated simply because of my new position. You will not use my crown to advance yourselves, to arrange favorable matches, or to claim privileges you have not earned through your own conduct. And you will treat every person beneath your notice, every servant, every quiet daughter in every family you encounter, with the respect I was so rarely given growing up. Lady Miriam's eyes filled with tears, though whether from relief or shame, Alira could not fully tell. That is more mercy than I expected, she said quietly. It is not mercy without expectation, Alira said firmly. If I learn that you have forgotten this conversation, that you have returned to old habits the moment it becomes convenient, the consequences will not be so gentle a second time. Cassia spoke next, her voice steadier than it had been in weeks. I accept those terms, fully, and I intend to prove, over time, that I meant what I said in the garden. Meredith nodded in agreement, still quiet, but with a new firmness in her expression that Alira had not seen from her sister before. Draven watched the exchange with quiet approval, and once the terms had been settled, he rose to signal the meeting's end. Then it is decided, he said. Alira has chosen wisdom over vengeance, which speaks more to her character as future queen than any punishment I might have handed down myself. As Alira's family filed out of the room, Lady Miriam paused at the door, turning back for a brief moment. For what it is worth, she said quietly, I am proud of the woman you have become. I only wish I had seen it sooner. Alira offered a small, careful smile. Not quite forgiveness, not yet, but the first honest step toward something that might, in time, grow into it. So do I, she said simply. Once the room had emptied, Draven turned to her, something like admiration clear in his golden eyes. That took more strength than stripping their titles ever would have, he said quietly. I did not want to build my new life on the ashes of my old one, Alira said. I wanted to build it on something better than what I was given. Draven reached for her hand, the familiar warmth of the bond settling comfortably between them. Then let us begin building it, he said. Together. The wedding took place beneath a sky so clear, it seemed the heavens themselves had cleared every cloud to witness the joining of the Alpha King and his fated queen. The gardens of the royal residence had been transformed for the occasion. Strings of soft golden light woven through the trees, pathways lined with flowers in every shade Alira had ever imagined, and several she had not. She stood at the edge of the garden in a gown of pale ivory, watching the gathered crowd from a quiet distance, taking one last private moment before stepping forward into the rest of her life. Nora adjusted the final fold of her veil, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Nervous?" Nora asked gently. Alira considered the question honestly, searching for the familiar knot of anxiety that had accompanied nearly every important moment of her life until now. She found, to her quiet surprise, that it was not there. "No," she said. "For the first time, I think I am simply ready." She walked the length of the garden alone, past rows of familiar and unfamiliar faces, past representatives from packs across the entire kingdom who had traveled great distances to witness this union, past her own family, seated near the front, watching with expressions that held none of the old mockery, only something that looked, finally, like genuine pride. Draven waited for her at the end of the path, dressed in formal robes befitting his crown, though his eyes, when they found hers, held none of the careful distance he had worn as a stranger on the selection field weeks earlier. They held only warmth and certainty, and the quiet joy of a man who had spent years wondering if this moment would ever come, and had finally stopped wondering the day a quiet girl in a gray dress had stepped forward from the back of a line. The ceremony passed in a blur of soft words and warm sunlight, the elder speaking ancient vows that bound not only their names, but the fate that had already bound their souls long before either of them understood what it meant. When Draven finally slid a simple gold band onto her finger, its design echoing the crescent and star of her mate mark, Alira felt the last remaining doubt she had carried since that first strange, aching pull in her chest finally settle into something whole and complete. "I, Draven Ashthorn, take you, Alira Voss, as my mate, my queen, and my equal," he said, his voice steady, despite the emotion clear beneath it. "I vow to see you fully, every day, in every way your family once failed to." Alira felt tears slip freely down her cheeks now, unable and unwilling to hold them back any longer. "I, Alira Voss," she said, her voice trembling slightly with the weight of the moment, "take you, Draven Ashthorn, as my mate, my king, and my equal. I vow to stand beside you, not as someone grateful simply to be chosen, but as someone who chooses you in return, fully, and without hesitation, every day that follows this one." The garden erupted into applause as Draven lowered his head to seal their vows, and Alira, for the first time in her entire life, did not feel the urge to shrink from the attention surrounding her. She stood fully in the center of it, seen and celebrated, exactly as she was. Weeks later, at her formal coronation, Alira stood before the entire gathered court once more, this time not as a hopeful candidate at the edge of a crowd, but as queen, crowned beside the man whose golden eyes had found her among hundreds, and had never once looked away since. Cassia and Meredith stood among the nobility, watching with expressions of genuine pride rather than practiced mockery, their relationship with their youngest sister still healing, still imperfect, but steadily, carefully, growing into something real. As the golden crown settled onto her head, Alira thought back to the carriage ride weeks ago, to her sister's cruel laughter, to her mother's quiet instruction to stand at the back and not embarrass the family. She thought of every year spent believing herself unworthy of notice, every quiet corner she had folded herself into rather than risk being seen and found lacking. None of that girl was gone entirely. She still carried the careful watchfulness, the quiet strength born from years of learning to survive unnoticed. But she was no longer defined by the smallness her family had once tried to press upon her. She had found, in the most unexpected way imaginable, a man who saw her fully from the very first moment their eyes met, and a version of herself she had never been permitted to become, until fate itself intervened. Alira Voss, once the forgotten daughter mocked by her own sisters, once dismissed as too plain, too quiet, too easily overlooked, stood now at the very center of the kingdom, crowned not because of beauty or ambition or careful maneuvering, but because a bond older than either of them had recognized, from the very beginning, exactly who she had always been worth being. She reached for Draven's hand, and he took it without hesitation, the same steady warmth that had first settled the ache in her chest weeks ago, now a permanent, comfortable presence in her life. Ready? He asked quietly, as the court began to cheer around them. Elira smiled, fully, freely, in a way she had never quite allowed herself before that strange and unforgettable day on the selection field. I have never been more ready for anything, she said. And together, hand in hand, they turned to face the kingdom that would now call them both its own.